Welcome to the channel. I am BudsterBrown, here to offer a Gen Z perspective on classic and continuing entertainment, today ranking Jesus movies recommended by you, the viewer. My last on-camera video was a year ago where I ranked a bunch of Jesus movies, and that became my most popular video on the channel, outside of YouTube Shorts and a couple Lego videos that I made like a decade ago as a prepubescent teenager. And what was so awesome about that video to me is that you guys actually came out and commented on it like crazy, saying, hey, I wish you would have watched this movie, maybe you could have looked at that one. And to celebrate the Easter season and to thank all of you for commenting and wishing that I had reviewed certain movies that I didn't have the chance to get to, I've decided to do a sequel video to look at some of the movies that you guys thought I missed. All of the Jesus movies we're going to be looking at today were recommended by you, the viewer. And if you're wondering where some big hitters are, like The Passion of the Christ, The Last Temptation of Christ, 3 different versions of King of Kings, Jesus of Nazareth, and many, many more, I would highly recommend checking out that first video. However, you can watch this one first, save that one for later, whatever floats your boat. However, there was one movie last year that my commenters didn't feel like I gave an adequate review for some reason.
Jesus Christ Superstar, do you think you're what they say?
I couldn't tell you why. So at the end of this video, I will be re-reviewing and re-ranking Jesus Christ Superstar. But let's not waste any more time. We have 15 movies we're going to be looking at today, spanning over 125 years, so let's get started. Starting in 1903, we have The Life in Passion, which is a 44-minute silent film and is often cited as the first feature-length narrative of the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. If you watched my first video, you'll know that I'm not exactly the biggest fan of silent films. However, this one came as a recommendation from one of our commenters on the last video, and so I figured, hey, I'll give it a shot. And to avoid my thoughts on these silent films seeming very repetitive and redundant, I'll try to focus on some of the things that stood out to me in them as opposed to giving you the full play-by-play. If you're watching this video, I imagine you're at least familiar with the story of Christ and a lot of his teachings, and one of the best things that I can say about this movie is that I would say it has overall pretty good coverage of all of the Bible stories from the Gospels that you would really want to see, including the Transfiguration and Jesus walking on water, which is something that most of the Jesus movies in my last video didn't even attempt. In fact, only one movie did the Transfiguration, which was Jesus from 1979. Did it look particularly good? No. But it's from 1903, so we're going to cut it some slack. However, unfortunately, we get to the part where it is a silent film. It is framed like a play, like a lot of these older silent films are. And so I really find myself uninvested in this movie. However, for 44 minutes, getting all of these great stories, including some that you rarely see in other Jesus movies, I can give it props for that. I can give it props for attempting to do something new, and I can give it props for pushing the art form of film forward and evolving the craft. But outside of it being a novelty, I really can't recommend this to anyone unless you're looking for an early adaptation of Jesus on film. Because this is an antiquated and archaic version of the story, I am not going to be plugging it into our ranking system today. And I feel very similarly about 1912's From the Manger to the Cross, which is an hour and 10-minute independent French silent film that follows the life of Jesus. Just like The Life and Passion, I don't derive a whole lot of enjoyment out of this movie outside of me being a curious film student. But there are some cool things that I would like to point out. Whereas The Life and Passion felt more like it was framed as a play, we start to see a little bit more of modern shot composition working its way into this movie. We have different angles, and for someone who studied film, it is kind of fun to see the little evolutions that we are seeing only a decade after our last movie. I'm notoriously not a fan of cutaways in silent films where they show you the text and say, this is what a character's saying. However, in the case of a Jesus story, having the actual scriptures and the quotes that go with them in the bottom corner, I think is a good touch, which makes it feel like you're just getting some visual aids to go along with your reading of the Bible. And in many ways, this feels like a precursor to Cecil D. DeMille's King of Kings that we see in 1927, I believe. And I reviewed that movie last time, and I actually thought it was pretty good for a silent film. I even ranked that one. However, this one is definitely not as well composed, as well acted. I would say the biggest problem with this movie is the pacing is just so slow, and I don't think that the content of the movie really justified this poor pacing. So unfortunately, I didn't really enjoy watching this one. It was kind of a drag. I was just waiting for it to end, and even though there's a couple little nuggets of film evolution that is fun to watch the art form grow a little bit, overall, wasn't really a fan of this movie, and once again, I'm not going to be ranking From the Manger to the Cross either. But if you're curious and you want to see some of the earlier adaptations of Jesus, feel free to check it out. But moving on to 1954, we have Day of Triumph, directed by Irving Pitchell. Day of Triumph follows the life of Christ during a time of Roman oppression on the Jewish people, who look for a Messiah as the answer to their problems. This movie stars Robert Wilson as Jesus and James Griffith as Judas Iscariot. This is the first real movie that we're going to be looking at today for this Jesus ranking video, and I'm gonna be honest, I watched all of these movies in chronological order for the most part, and at this point in the video, I was getting a little bit worried. I had just sat through 2 silent films, and by the time I got to Day of Triumph and just looked at that cover, I mean, like, jeez. I was thinking I was in for a rough ride, and thankfully, I was wrong. I actually found this movie pretty interesting and a Jesus story with a little bit of a unique twist. And this will be a reoccurring theme throughout this video because I hit most of the big mainstream movies that you expect to see on Jesus. So by the time we're getting to this video, what you're going to be getting is a little bit more of the offshoots. It starts off with Jewish zealot rebels planning a uprising against the Roman Empire, and they get caught immediately trying to meet and ultimately have to run away. They all converge and decide, hey, we gotta scatter and lay low for a little bit, where they end up running into this guy, Jesus of Nazareth, and they think, hey, this could be our Messiah figure that we can use to prop up our rebellion and finally conquer the Romans. And the right-hand man of the chief zealot in this movie is Judas Iscariot, who met Jesus and has full confidence that he can get him wrapped around his finger and just suggest these little ideas to him to ultimately get Jesus to want to rebel against the Romans and do what Judas and the other zealots want him to do. But as the months go on, as the years go on, and the zealot keeps checking back in with Judas like, hey, have you influenced him yet? Does it look like he's about to make some changes? And Judas is like, yeah, I'm just about to get around to that, you gotta wait. It's all about the timing, if you think about it.
Speaking too soon might have ruined everything.
Until we get to Palm Sunday, and he's like, I'm a believer. I think Jesus is the guy, and ultimately ends up leaving the zealot's side. However, when things go a little bit awry in the temple, Judas goes back to his old ways and ends up betraying Jesus, which, leads to him feeling very guilty and unaliving himself.
I have sinned!
However, looking at this movie through Judas's POV of Jesus, and that's how we really discover Jesus and look at Jesus throughout this whole movie, I thought was a really interesting and fresh take. And this is one of my favorite versions of Judas. Now, just because Judas is the main character doesn't mean that Jesus doesn't get a lot of screen time. He's in this movie quite a bit. However, it's not from his perspective. It's from people, not just Judas, other people viewing him, watching him, starting to believe in him. He is more of a symbol in this movie than an actual fully three-dimensional character. And for what they're trying to do, I honestly think this version worked really well. He's got a very powerful Charlton Heston-esque delivery to his vocal lines.
He who has ears to hear, let him hear.
Which, doesn't really fit that well for Jesus, just in my opinion and what I'm looking for, but it's not bad. And I would say he's compassionate enough, stern enough, serious enough. He hits the beats adequately enough that I'm willing to give Robert Wilson's version of Jesus a C rank. Also, if you didn't watch my first video, I ranked the portrayals of Jesus along with the movie itself. Now, Day of Triumph isn't perfect. For one, I would say the way it's shot leaves something to be desired. It's not particularly artful. It's very standard at the end of the day. Not bad, just okay. And as I mentioned, Judas is kind of the main character. However, the movie doesn't end when Judas dies. It goes through all of the plot beats you expect, with Jesus getting crucified, Jesus being resurrected, and all of that happens when Judas is not in the movie, and he was by far the best part of this movie. So when you get to the last act, it feels very generic and somewhat uninspired. However, for the movie itself, I thought this was a fresh, unique take on the Jesus story, and it differentiated itself enough to justify its own existence. And this is in 1954, for crying out loud. It didn't even need to at this point. But before I rank this movie, I do want to establish the rubric, because it's a little bit different from my last video. I was trying to make sure it was within the spirit of the gospel, being decently accurate. I wanted them to explore Jesus as fully man and fully God. It's a little bit different this time around, because so many of these movies I'm watching are either trying to be a fresh take on the Jesus story, or it's borderline a Jesus adjacent movie. So when I'm looking at these movies, I'm not necessarily ranking it on traditional points. I want to see how fresh the idea is, while still being relatively within the spirit of the Gospels, but it doesn't necessarily even have to be accurate. It doesn't even necessarily have to be about Jesus, though he definitely needs to be front and center in some capacity. So with that said, I thought Day of Triumph was a fresh, unique idea with minimal flaws, but significant enough that I can't give it an A rank, so I'm going to give Day of Triumph a B rank. But moving on to 1959, we have Ben Hur, directed by William Wyler, starring Charlton Heston as Judah Ben Hur, which follows a Jewish prince seeking revenge against his former Roman best friend, Messala, all set during the time of Jesus Christ. You guys know how I said Jesus adjacent movies, right? I would say this one is by far the most adjacent out of all of the movies on this list, where you might be wondering when you're watching it, is this even a Jesus movie? And I would argue yes, in a way, but we'll get to that a little bit later in the video. I was planning on watching this movie in my first video, but then I realized that Jesus was barely in it, and so I decided not to. But for this one, I think it fits in just a little bit better, and I am so glad I watched it, because this is by far the best movie that I watched on this entire list, bar none. Ben Hur is freaking awesome. And I say that with no exaggeration. You might have noticed I've been criticizing some of these movies for not having very modern filmmaking, with more stage-like framing or old antiquated shots, and how they don't hold up to modern expectations. Ben Hur does not look like modern movies. It looks better. The colors in this movie just pop. That ultra wide aspect ratio just shows off so much of this world. It makes it feel so grand in a way that, you know, it's really hard to describe unless you've seen this movie. So many of the shots just feel like paintings, with so much thought and care put into the compositions, artfully crafted by William Wyler, this director, this genius now in my eyes. I was absolutely blown away by the scale. Even some of the obvious old outdated special effects, like with the Roman ships in the sea, still look pretty good, and they look good enough that it didn't take me out of the experience at all. I was thoroughly sucked in and invested to the journey that Ben Hur is going on, from being this Jewish prince whose family is thrown in prison by his former best friend as he rides this chariot, and all of that is just so fascinating. And, you know, maybe one day I would do a whole video on Ben Hur. However, this is a Jesus movie ranking video, and as much as I'd love to yabber on about the chariot race and how I think Judah Ben Hur is a really good character and so on and so forth, we gotta focus on the Jesus-centric elements, because that is the purpose and intent of this video. Jesus is essentially the heart, soul, and thematic through line that ties this movie together. He's not in it that much. He shows up in the beginning, where you get to see the birth of Jesus, the middle, where he gives Judah Ben Hur some water when he's dying of thirst as he's being sold into slavery, and you see him with the Sermon on the Mount a little bit later, after Judah gets his revenge, and then later you get to see his crucifixion. And an interesting creative choice that Ben Hur decides to go with is not letting you see Jesus's face. In a way, I was a little bit annoyed by it at first because I was just curious what he looks like, but at the end of the day, I ultimately did like the choice once the movie was over to keep it obscured, because that's not really what it's about. Looking at his face could take away from the main character, that being Charlton Heston as Ben Hur. So I'll briefly tell you what I think is going on in this movie. Ben Hur is sold into slavery, and he's sort of given up on God in a lot of ways and thinks that God hates him or whatever it is. But there is this constant symbol of water being used to express salvation, where when Ben Hur is dying of thirst, Jesus comes out of nowhere and gives him water. When Ben Hur saves this Roman general on his makeshift raft and they finally get picked up by the other Romans in a ship, they give both of them water, a sign of salvation, which actually leads to Ben Hur becoming a high-status individual in Rome, which gives him the opportunity to do that chariot race with Messala and get his revenge. However, when he gets his revenge, he finds out that his mom and his sister, who had been imprisoned by Messala, now have leprosy. And his revenge, while satisfying for us, ultimately ends up ringing hollow. It's not what brings him satisfaction. And his girlfriend, so to speak, ends up saying, hey, you really got to listen to this Jesus guy. They end up meeting his family of lepers, and they end up trying to take him to Jesus, only to find him being whipped and carrying his cross so he would be crucified. And Ben Hur seems fascinated with this person, and he tries to give him a drink of water. And when he does that, he sees that it's the man who saved him so long ago. But Ben Hur can't give Jesus the water. It gets slapped away because at the end of the day, Jesus is the Savior. Jesus saves. He is not being saved. And as he's dying, they do some very artful and creative cuts back and forth between this water pouring down from the heavens. And then and only then is when Ben Hur's family, his sister, his mother, get cured of their leprosy after the sacrifice, after the water cleanses the earth. It's something where when you're watching the movie and you think about it, it is beautiful, and it does tie the themes of the movie together, where God does care about you even when you don't know about it, that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and the Savior. And having him also as the backdrop just does add a more biblical and cinematic weight to the movie, more so than it already had. Where I have trouble with Ben Hur, it really is so far away from any of the other Jesus movies and just being radically different and not really about the life of Christ. I don't really know how I should rank it. I'm not even going to rank Jesus, in fact. However, thematically, I think it's very strong, and it is, as I mentioned, the best movie that I've watched. Honestly, this would be the first movie to get an S rank if this was just based on how much I enjoyed it, but we're not looking at that today. This is the Jesus movie ranking video. However, the Christ-centered themes and Christ himself being in this movie are so strong, as well as it just being an incredible movie. I'd really feel bad if I gave it anything less than an A rank.
That was cool!
But moving on to 1973, we have Godspell, which is a modern retelling of the Gospels in New York City. And it's also a musical, and it stars people, and was directed by someone. I'm going to be incredibly generous and not point out the commenter who recommended this movie to me, because this was one of the most painful, excruciating watches that I've ever had the displeasure of sitting through. I despised this movie. I have rarely felt this much pain having to sit through a movie in my entire life. Like, Madam Web is the only other thing that's really coming to mind right now as something that I just thought was so incredibly bad. The music was bad. I didn't like any of it. The characters are so awful. The apostles are so annoying.
Oh, master, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you drink?
Yeah, or in prison and helped you.
They act like kindergartners. That's like the best way I could describe it, but they're adults. And they're all dressed like goofy clowns for some reason. And Jesus is not exempt from this. In fact, when I first saw Jesus in this movie, when it cuts to him, I was like, oh, is that the devil? Because he looks horrible. And I'm like, oh no, that's Jesus.
The righteous shall have eternal life. Come on!
I really can't describe, guys, just how much this movie was not for me. It was so, it was just like pain. I wish I could articulate to you just how much this movie was not my vibe. The performances were not my vibe. The setting was not my vibe. The music was not my vibe.
Your prospects are worse. Your wife is sighing.
The characters were not my vibe. This Jesus was not my vibe. The fresh take on an old story was not my vibe this time around. And everyone has a different level of things that they find sacrilegious, and some people are definitely more extreme than me. Like, I understand those who can't watch Last Temptation of Christ. They think it's just too far gone, and that makes sense. I'm not going to criticize you for that. This movie to me is worse somehow. I felt sick that this is the portrayal of my Lord and Savior that they decided to go for. And I'm really not trying to preach from a high horse here. This is just how I personally felt about the movie, but how I personally felt was just gross. Easily in the top 5 worst movies I've ever seen. And I didn't think I was ever going to do this. You might have noticed I've been using the Sonic Adventure 2 ranking system for all the movies that I rank. And I was going to keep it to that game, but with the advent of this movie existing, I unfortunately have to introduce a new rank because Godspell and its Jesus gets an F rank. But moving on to 1986, we have, forgive me if you speak Spanish, I'm so sorry, you have to hear this. La vida de nuestro señor, jesucristo. I apologize, Spanish was never my best subject, but directed by Miguel Zacharias, this story follows the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, with great emphasis on his early years, featuring Claudio Brook as Jesus. So I know I said it was made in 1986, but I've seen sources that said it was filmed as early as 1971. The commenter who recommended this said I should check out the Life of Jesus trilogy. However, this is obviously just one movie, so what I'm guessing is that this was originally filmed around 1971, but this re-edited version into one singular movie is the one that was done in the year 1986, and whatever I said in Spanish horribly is what I watched on Tubi, and that is the movie I am reviewing. I would say the main thing that sets it apart for me is the emphasis on the joyful part of Jesus's life, Jesus's youth. I have not seen a movie yet that focuses so much on Jesus as a young toddler and Jesus as a preteen, and that is what comprises the first hour of this 2-hour and 10-minute movie. And because it puts so much focus on Jesus's early life, it has to extrapolate a lot of material in order to try and flesh out that runtime, and I would say it has varying results. For one, I felt that the nativity was a little bit drawn out. I did like the focus on Mother Mary. We don't usually get to see that a lot in these Jesus movies, outside of really the Passion, to be honest. But I felt like her relationship with her son Jesus was emphasized a little bit more here, and you know, I like that. Jesus as a toddler felt a lot like filler. They're kind of having to make up miracles, like him stretching out this wood when Joseph accidentally cuts something wrong. And I just kept thinking to myself like, ugh, didn't really work for me at the beginning of this movie. That being said, one of the most interesting stories I think about in the Bible is when Jesus goes missing and then they find him in the temple 3 days later, talking to other high priests and theologians, and he's like, didn't you know I'd be about my Father's business? Something like that. I'm really bad at memorizing scripture and passages, but I always wondered to myself, how did this conversation start? Why are they all just chatting with this 12-year-old boy? What I love about this movie is it explored that question. Jesus just kind of walks in as Joseph and Mary are leaving the city, and he just starts talking, and these high priests are like, what is this boy doing here? Get him out. But then they're like, no, we'll have a little bit of fun with him. And then he starts hitting them with some really hard-hitting intellectual questions that they can't quite answer. And what I love is Joseph ends up finding Jesus talking to these Pharisees in the temple. And instead of immediately grabbing him, he just kind of listens to him, having these intellectual sparring sessions with these other high priests. You know, I just really enjoyed it, and it's the last story we get to hear about Jesus in his youth. Another thing I like is that they focus on the relationship with him and John the Baptist as a kid. It's not deep, but I do just like seeing little toddler John the Baptist and Jesus hanging out. You know, it's just kind of fun. However, where the first half felt a little bit too spread out, I would say the second half felt a little bit too fast-paced, where they had to really start cramming things in order to get Jesus to where he needs to be at the end of the movie, where he is getting crucified. I also don't have anything particularly nice to say about this version of Jesus. I thought Claudio Brooks' portrayal of Jesus was adequate, to say the least, you know, kind of stock. He did have a royal, high priestly demeanor about him when he walked around and did miracles. Definitely leaned more into the divine nature of Jesus as opposed to the human side of Jesus. But I thought he worked fine for the movie. I thought he was doing an adequate job, and I'm going to give this version of Jesus a C rank. However, even though it felt a little bit jam-packed, I will say that I did like how they portrayed the crucifixion in this movie. I felt that they had some really cool shots, and they played around with interesting camera angles, focusing on the sun in weird ways as he's being crucified. And they even showed all of these dead corpses rising out of the ground and walking out of their graves, like they say happens in the Bible when Jesus was crucified. This is like the only one of these movies that I recall that actually showed that, and so I thought it was pretty cool that they included it here. Another thing that they did in this movie is start off with the fall of Adam and Eve and the creation of Earth and so on and so forth. And they had some cool visuals to portray that, even if, you know, it's kind of an older movie and they're limited in what they can do. But overall, I just think this movie's okay. The pacing is a little bit wonky, it is a little bit old and antiquated. The performances are just alright from what I can tell. It is in Spanish, and you know, that's not my native language, as you've probably could tell by me reading the title of this movie. That being said, I did have a good enough time with it, so I'm going to give, oh boy, here we go again, La vida de nuestro señor jesucristo a C rank. I need to take some Spanish lessons or something. But moving on to 1995, we have The Revolutionary, the epic version, directed by Robert Marcarelli and starring John K. Steele as Jesus. Unlike many of the other movies on this list, this isn't a Jesus movie that has a really fresh take on things. It is a pretty average telling of the Jesus story, except it was made in the 90s, baby. And you know what that means? Spotty CGI. While I can appreciate them trying to do something a little bit more groundbreaking, introducing some technological innovations to make these miracles pop.
For unto you is born this day, in the city of David, a savior.
Didn't really work in this movie. At the very beginning of the movie, when I saw some of the big swings they were taking, I knew they were going to attempt the walking on water scene. And, yep, they sure attempted it, all right.
It's Jesus?
Now, you know, at least they tried. The Revolutionary also suffers from comically bad acting from basically all of the characters, but also John K. Steele's version of Jesus.
If it's really you, make me come to you on the water.
Then come!
This has got to be one of the funniest versions of the Jesus story, just based on how poorly they implemented all of these ideas that they were thinking and the timing of everything. Like, anytime he does a miracle, it's like,
Who touched me? Be clean.
it is like so ridiculous. It honestly reminded me of the greatest action story ever told. I'm not joking.
I'm programmed to protect you.
Stop! Stop killing Judas!
I would say in the back half, it starts to improve a little bit more. Because of the overacting of this version of Jesus, it actually kind of made the crucifixion work in ways that a lot of other versions don't, where they kind of have him just, no selling it the whole time. This Jesus didn't do that. He looked like he was in pain. There are a couple of good scenes in this movie, like Jesus healing the Roman centurion's servant just through his faith in Jesus. I thought that was good. Jesus asking the apostles who they think he is at the campfire. Nicodemus coming to Jesus wanting to learn about baptism and theology. Jesus talking about the prodigal son. I think it was another good version of that parable. But so much of this movie is just so hilariously bad that I really can't give The Revolutionary or its version of Jesus anything better than a D rank. But moving on to 1999, we have Jesus, directed by Roger Young, starring Jeremy Sisto as the title character. Oh boy. This is an interesting one. Movies like this frustrate me a little bit because they often have really good ideas and really good concepts that they're playing with, but the execution just kind of doesn't work. And it's like, oh, I want to like this movie, but I can't fully get there. You know what I'm saying? I would say out of all of the Jesuses we've looked at today, this portrayal of the character from Jeremy Sisto feels the most like a regular guy. We get a lot of extrapolated material on him hanging out with Joseph, talking to this girl that wants to marry him as well in his hometown, him having political disagreements with Joseph, the usual stuff. And then when Joseph dies, that actually starts his journey into becoming the Messiah. He's got to reject that girl that, wants to marry him, and he has to go and do his mission. Then events start unfolding a little bit more as you'd expect. What makes it unique, other than fleshing out Jesus's life before he became the Messiah a little bit, is the execution of Jesus's intellectual, spiritual battles with the devil, both during his 40-day stay in the desert and the Garden of Gethsemane. I'll start with the 40 days in the desert, though. This has always been one of my favorite stories in the Bible, where Jesus has to fight it out with the devil. Like The Revolutionary, they use a lot of spotty CGI to try and enhance this scene and have some unique visuals, and I think it was mostly a miss because it, doesn't look very good, but conceptually that's what I've always wanted from this scene. Just some high budget version of Jesus morphing to different spots, fighting with the devil as the devil takes different forms. I just think that it heightens the moment to a cinematic level, and I see the potential of what they were trying to do. It is one of those times where you can really feel the temptation that Jesus might be feeling in that moment. And it gets even worse with his agony in the garden, where he is suffering, and then the devil decides to make another appearance, showing what happens after he dies. He shows him all of these world wars. He shows him the crusades where people will kill in the name of Christ. You see Jesus having to grapple with all of these things and question if his sacrifice is even worth it in the first place, as opposed to just using his power as God to divinely rule the world or something. Once again, conceptually, I think that this is pretty cool, but what's really lacking is the writing. The dialogue feels a little bit preachy and overbearing, and Jesus doesn't feel like he has the best responses to what the devil is saying, and maybe that makes sense because the devil's smart, and maybe, I don't know, I'm getting convinced by his arguments or something, but it is something where I feel like a little bit of better writing, a little bit of Jesus feeling smarter would have really helped elevate this scene, and that was just not there for me. But moving on to something that I really didn't like about this movie was Jeremy Sisto's portrayal of Jesus. Look, I'm fine with you leaning into the man side of him, but bro borderline felt like a frat bro at times. He always just seems kind of pissed off and angry, but when he was happy, I don't know, it didn't feel like a genuine happiness. It just felt like kind of a schwarmy happiness. A scene that sticks out in my mind is when he's at the wedding of Cana and he's just kind of partying and dancing, and all of his apostles and disciples are like, hey, is this guy gonna like be the Messiah or something? And then when he sits down, he seems like genuinely perturbed that his mom asked him to turn the water into the wine, and I can see that interpretation if you just look at the text literally, but it felt like he was less upset about, oh, my mom's trying to jumpstart my mission as the Messiah. It more felt like he was upset that he had to stop partying.
I was only...
Jesus,
Yes.
there is no wine left.
Yes, Mother, what concern is that to me?
I will say, because of his emotional volatility and just seeming kind of angry, when he was crashing out in the temple and he's flipping the tables and screaming like a lunatic, I kind of like that scene, I'm not gonna lie.
We'll make this the house of God! Get out of here! These things out of here! Get these things out of here!
But other than just a couple of interesting moments, I really didn't like this version of Jesus, and I'm going to give him a D rank. One last thing I want to mention that was interesting about Jesus 1999 before ranking it is that Gary Oldman plays Pontius Pilate, and it is one of the wildest versions of this character that I have seen. This isn't like Gary Oldman playing Commissioner Gordon in the Dark Knight trilogy. This is like Gary Oldman from Leon the Professional. He is actually legitimately an insane man in this movie. The way that it plays out is it's almost like he is orchestrating this scenario for Jesus to get brought in. And all those lines in the Bible where Pilate seems like he might be sympathetic towards Jesus are really him just trying to manipulate the crowd to make sure that he gets crucified because he sees him as this guy who is somewhat of a threat.
Don't you want me to release the King of the Jews?
You hear what they want, Jesus? They'd rather have a murderer than you.
And I'm actually someone who likes a more sympathetic version of Pilate usually. But this was just such a bizarro version of Pilate that I almost kind of had to respect it, and I like how hard they went for it. And that actually worked a lot for me. So overall, I think Jesus 1999 made some big swings, kind of stuck the landing sometimes, but ultimately to me, kind of fumbled the bag, which is why I'm going to give Jesus a D rank. But moving on to the year 2000, we have The Miracle Maker, directed by Derek W. Haynes and Stanislav Sokolov. This movie stars Ray Fiennes as Jesus in this claymation retelling of the story of Christ. Out of all the movies that was recommended to me by my commentators, The Miracle Maker seemed to be the one that popped up the most, that people were sad that I didn't get around to the first time. So I was really excited to check this one out, but did it live up to the hype? We'll have to see. I will say at the outset, I did think it was interesting that they got Ray Fiennes to voice Jesus. I mean, Voldemort himself is voicing Jesus. That'd be like if you had the Green Goblin play Jesus. Oh wait.
You know how much I sacrificed?
Unlike Willem Dafoe's portrayal of Jesus from The Last Temptation of Christ, where it actually kind of felt like the Green Goblin was playing Jesus,
Suffer the little children.
Ray Fiennes' version of Jesus feels much more in line with what I'd like to see from the character. He's personable, approachable, he seems compassionate. However, when people start to question him, he's not afraid to up the intensity a little bit.
You have made it into a den of thieves!
That being said, I do think it is clear that Ray Fiennes is not a traditionally seasoned voice actor. I think he's doing a good job in this role, but I feel like the performance could have just been slightly better. Also, there's a couple of animation quirks that I think hold his performance back a little bit as well, but I'll get into that later. For now, I'll say I really liked the character's portrayal overall, and I'm going to give Ray Fiennes' Jesus a B rank. I would say the number one thing that makes Miracle Maker good is how they play with animation in this movie. For the most part, and through the majority of this movie, when scenes are grounded, they use claymation, which I think was a very smart choice. You see, unlike 2D animation or 3D animation, when you're filming with claymation, there is an actual camera on an actual environment, an actual world created by people. And because of that, claymation feels to me more tangible than other forms of animation. However, there's a couple moments where it goes into a 2D art style that feels almost like an ancient painting, which I thought was a really smart choice. And they use this animation style to showcase flashbacks, illustrate some parables, but my favorite usage being when they're trying to elevate a mystic or supernatural moment. My favorite moment of this is when Jesus exorcises 7 demons from Mary Magdalene. It's stylistically really cool, but then when that animation slowly transitions out into claymation again, it feels like, oh, Mary's world is finally grounded again. She feels at peace, and it brings you back into reality after something very fantastical just happened. And I really, really love their usage of that. There's plenty more moments like this in the movie that utilize the 2D animation style, such as the Good Samaritan or the Nativity. But by now you guys get the gist that these 2D animated scenes really elevate a lot of the supernatural mystic moments, and it makes this movie feel really special. The last big thing I want to talk about with The Miracle Maker is how it spends a lot of time post-resurrection. A lot of these movies like to just be like, oh, look, he's back, and that's that, and go feed my sheep, so on and so forth. But this movie puts special care into building up the return of Jesus, building up his arrival to meeting with the apostles, where Mary finds him, the apostles don't believe. Then Cleopas and Jairus come and they talk about how they met this man on the road, with another beautifully hand-drawn 2D segment, and how Cleopas talked to this stranger and he took him into his home, only to later learn that it was Jesus Christ himself telling him that he was back and resurrected. And you start seeing the hope build in the apostles that maybe he really is back. And of course, Thomas has some extra doubts as always, but when Jesus returns, it does feel like this triumphant moment, this earned moment. And not that the crucifixion isn't enough to earn the moment, but it feels especially satisfying in this movie. And it's another reason I really, really love it. I do have a couple of things that I don't like about it. For starters, I'm a little bit mixed on the claymation. They'll occasionally do these clunky cuts. One that comes to mind is when Jesus learns about John the Baptist dying, and then it does this hard cut to him laying face first on the ground, and it was unintentionally hilarious, and I don't think that was the intended emotion for the scene. Sometimes the walking looks a little bit clunky and low budget, and sometimes the models of the characters don't look that great. I'm specifically thinking of Jairus' daughter, who gets a lot of screen time in this movie, and that's another thing I'm a little bit mixed about. Jairus and his family are a big subplot in this movie. They actually open the movie where Jairus hears his daughter is sick and she's not going to be able to recover, and his daughter notices Jesus and wants to talk with him, but Jairus is a little bit apprehensive. And eventually, when she's on death's door, he pleads with Jesus to go and heal her, which he does, and then they essentially become pseudo-apostles / disciples, and they stick around for the whole movie. And, well, I think it was nice to have that through line. It didn't quite work for me, and I can't exactly articulate why it didn't work for me as much, but it felt like it would have been better if it focused more on Jesus coming into his ministry, and maybe a little bit less on Jairus and his family, especially because I think Jairus' daughter has one of the worst animation models in the movie. Other than that, though, I think the movie's great. It's well-paced, has interesting animations, a great portrayal of Jesus. I could see myself re-watching this movie a lot. And while I do have some problems with it, I definitely think it earns itself a well-deserved B rank. But moving on to 2011, we have My Last Day, which is a 9-minute anime short film and was directed by Barry Cook. Now, this is obviously not a feature-length film. This is a little breather segment, but a commenter did recommend that I check it out, and apparently it's animated by the same team that did Berserk, which has historically been one of my favorite animes, so I thought, hey, I'll check it out and briefly give my thoughts on it. And I liked it. I thought it was pretty good. It was very reminiscent of The Passion of the Christ because it was definitely more brutal. You get to see a lot more of Jesus' suffering. You get to see him on the cross. But what makes this unique is it actually focuses on the POV of the thief on the cross, showing his misdeeds of murder and feeling bad about that, and watching Jesus suffer and really feeling bad for him that this guy that did nothing wrong has to go through so much. And so when he ends up getting on the cross, he asks Jesus to remember him when he goes into his kingdom, and obviously Jesus says, "Surely I say to you, you will be with me in paradise." Then after they die, we get to see him in paradise, and it's a nice little moment. It's not exactly the most thematically rich, but it's a nice little story that encapsulates Christ's passion in a nutshell, and I think it's worth your time if you're not vigorously opposed to violence. But moving on to 2016, we have 40 Nights, which is a low-budget drama film about Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness after his baptism, focusing on his personal journey and temptations by the devil, starring DJ Perry as Jesus and Rance Howard as the devil. I'm not gonna lie, I just read that off Google. Plagiarism. As previously mentioned, I'm a big fan of Jesus going into the desert for 40 days and duking it out with the devil. And so, theoretically, a whole movie that fleshes out this scene seems like it would be pretty good. And I went into the movie knowing it was low budget. The commenter that recommended I checked it out informed me as much. I went in with very moderate expectations, and unfortunately, I came out not exactly liking the movie. There were some things that I liked. For one, I do think it's a good template. If you're going to do a movie about Jesus in the desert for 40 days, I like having him start off with John the Baptist baptizing him. Then he goes into the desert. You get a couple of flashbacks back to his family life that are meant to strengthen him in the moment. And you have a little bit of a fleshed out version of the devil tempting him. They even have the angel Gabriel coming in to spice things up. Another thing I did like about it though is when the devil came to tempt Jesus, he came in 3 different forms. First as a child, then as a temptress, and then as an older man. And it gave a different vibe to each of the temptations and helped distinguish them from one another, as well as giving the devil a main form that we could acknowledge as, maybe not his true form, but just something we could identify a little bit more clearly. Good ideas, good concepts. Other than that, there's not really a whole lot I liked about the movie. I mean, we got to point out the low budget elements. A lot of the performances and settings aren't exactly great. A lot of these actors just came off, I'll say not Middle Eastern. Like I said, it's fine because it's a low budget movie. A lot of the performances also felt low budget. In fact, I can't really say that any of them were particularly good. Very monotone, lacking a lot of energy, and when they do amp up the energy, it feels like they're overacting. And to me, DJ Perry seemed to have a rough time nailing down what he wanted to do with the character. It felt as someone trying to sound like he's saying something really powerful, but it ultimately ringing hollow. All I saw was a guy trying to pretend to be Jesus. That being said, I don't think he's horrible or sacrilegious or offensive in any way. I think he is a serviceable Jesus, minus a couple points, so I'm going to give DJ Perry's Jesus a D rank. But back to the movie, I think where it struggles the most is really fleshing out that runtime. I can forgive shoddy filmmaking if the writing's good, if the script's good, if the story is good. Unfortunately, it felt like this movie had a really hard time fleshing out its ideas and extrapolating on the original source material enough to make a feature-length film that felt satisfying. I think the best way that I would describe it is one of the temptations that the devil gives to Jesus when he's starving is by asking him to turn this rock into bread so he can eat. But in this movie, it felt like the devil kept being like, "Man, Jesus, you sure are hungry, aren't you?" And he just did that and followed him around for what felt like 5 to 10 minutes before he finally said the line, "You should turn that rock into bread." It felt like it did that a lot. They're kind of just meandering until they get to that punchline that we're waiting for. And that unfortunately is kind of like the whole movie. Another thing they do to break up the monotony of Jesus wandering around in the desert is having these flashbacks of his life with his family at his home, with his stepfather Joseph and Mother Mary, as they attempt to give insights into the current challenges Jesus is facing. I felt that the flashbacks were disconnected from what the movie was trying to do and didn't really hold that much weight to the current moment and the current problem. Conceptually, just like from a structural standpoint, I like that, and even though I don't think it was the best executed, it did give me a breather of, oh man, we're still in the desert. So I appreciated it for that reason. Good concept, good ideas, poor execution, and I think the budget and the script held this one back from reaching its full potential. But it's not horrible, I didn't hate watching it, so I'm going to give 40 Nights a D rank. But sticking in 2016, we have Risen. This movie follows a Roman military tribune, Clavius, who after putting down a Jewish revolt, has to make sure the crucifixion of an alleged Messiah goes smoothly, only for the body to disappear 3 days later, putting Clavius's career in jeopardy unless he finds it. This, much like Ben Hur, feels very much like a Jesus-adjacent film, where Jesus is in it, he's central to the themes, but he really takes a back seat. However, he is much more present in this movie than he was in Ben Hur. The thing I really appreciated about this movie is just how invested I was in the first half. They really do a good job making you sympathize with Clavius, this guy who just wants to be at peace and just be able to retire in Rome and live a good life and have a day without death. He just wants things to go smoothly, to gain favor with Pilate so he can move on to his greater career ambitions. And Jesus going missing puts a threat to that, so he is dead set on tracking the body down. And this is ancient Rome. It's going to be a lot harder than in modern day America or wherever you may live. So with the help of Draco Malfoy at his side, he starts the hunt and things begin to not add up. When he meets with one of the guards that was looking after Jesus' tomb, he is lying. When he threatens apostles that have claimed to see Jesus' resurrected body, they say they would rather die than expose where the rest of the apostles are. When he finally catches up to the other guard that was looking after Jesus' tomb, the guard confesses to the tomb being opened by light and the ropes around Jesus just exploding and him walking out of the tomb. And this story disturbs Clavius because where he's used to being able to tell if someone's lying, he can tell that this guard is telling the truth, and that's genuinely what he believes. The build up to him tracking down the apostles is really, really exciting, and it just invested me in the story. And when he finally does find them and he sees Jesus sitting among them alive after he saw him die on the cross, one of the coolest moments in the movie, it genuinely gave me chills. He ends up following the apostles, not to turn them in now, but just to know more about this Jesus guy. And he actually has this fun banter with St. Peter as he does it. That's actually one of my favorite, more jovial aspects of the movie, how he's always taking jabs at Peter, Peter's taking jabs at him. It definitely adds some levity to a movie that is mostly very serious. Near the end of the movie, though, Clavius finally gets to have a one-on-one conversation with Jesus after all of the other apostles have fallen asleep. And you just get this deep sense that Jesus knows what he wants, even saying things to him that we've heard Clavius say to Pilate. And that leads me to the portrayal of Jesus played by Cliff Curtis, who I thought did a really good job with the role. It's true that he doesn't have that much screen time, but I feel like he looks the part, he acts the part really well, he seems very compassionate, he seems very loving. For what we get from him, I think it's a really, really good version. And, you know, with Clavius talking to Jesus at the end, it almost feels like an audience insert, like, oh, this is what would be like if I could have talked to Jesus face to face. And for that, I think he did a really, really good job being personable, but also divine at the same time, which is why I'm going to give Cliff Curtis's version of Jesus a B rank. Now, while this is one of the better movies that I've watched for this video, there are a couple of little flaws that I do think hold it back just a little bit. For one, in the back half of the movie, it feels like they're meandering a little bit, and then the Romans start tracking them down when Clavius is with the apostles, and it felt like we didn't even really need that. I get that you need to have something kind of exciting, so it's not just Clavius waiting for his turn to talk to Jesus for 45 minutes. But I'd say a larger issue that I had with the film is that there just seems to be emotional impact that is missing. And I don't even know what it is, but some sort of core through line that really ties the movie together. I think the theme of Jesus's resurrection changing our lives so drastically that we're willing to give up everything to follow him is still strong, but I feel like there was an opportunity for more here. It didn't quite hit that level for me in the way that Ben Hur would have. Overall, I was super invested in this movie. I really liked what they did. I could see myself watching it again easily, and I'm going to give Risen a B rank. But moving on to 2018, we have Mary Magdalene. Oh boy. Directed by Garth Davis, this movie follows Mary Magdalene as she runs away from her arranged marriage to follow a radical new movement, led by a man named Jesus. Oh boy howdy. As soon as the credits rolled on this movie, I just knew I was gonna not want to talk about it. Alas, it was recommended to me and I was this close to putting it on my first video last year, so we gotta talk about it now. I'm going to be fully upfront with you guys right out of the gate. I did not really like this movie. I'll start off with some things that I liked about the movie. For one, I thought it was very well shot. Coming off something like 40 Days, you can really appreciate some good cinematography and color grading. And while it's true that the color grading is darker in this movie, it still looks pretty good. I think it fit the tone of the movie for what they were going for. I also think the performances are really well done. Rooney Mara as Mary Magdalene did an excellent job, and Joaquin Phoenix for this version of Jesus, I also think did an excellent job as well. I also think the performances from Peter and Judas were more than satisfactory, and just overall the performances in this movie were great. I will also say one of the things that has grown on me in this movie through reflection is Joaquin Phoenix's version of Jesus. He's definitely a little bit of an odd duck, as Joaquin Phoenix's roles tend to be, but for what it's worth, if you're going to be making Jesus movies, I'm okay with you taking liberties, and I think what they're trying to do with him, making him a little bit more quirky, a little bit more soft-spoken, and very mild-mannered, fit a particular version of Jesus I could see in the Bible. Is it my definitive version of the character? No, but it's not bad. And obviously Joaquin Phoenix, when he shows up to work, he shows up to work. And from what I can tell, he really invested himself in this character. One of my favorite scenes with him, and subsequently my favorite scene in this whole movie, is when they go to the temple. A little bit of preface is that Judas's wife and child have died, and when Jesus says the kingdom of heaven will be coming, you know, he thinks that means my wife and children are going to be coming. And so he has been pushing Jesus to start the revolution as he sees it. And when Jesus goes to the temple and he sees all of the merchandising and all of the sacrifices going on at the same time, they do some really beautiful and artful cuts of sacrifices of the lambs to him on the cross himself, and really drawing that connection that Jesus himself is the sacrificial lamb for all of us. It was really, really well done and was a super powerful moment in that movie. And just seeing this version of the character, especially who's been very mild-mannered and soft-spoken and kind, start to get visibly upset, starting to vibrate and starting to tear down the marketplace.
God's kingdom is not to be bought and sold!
I thought was a really powerful moment. And Judas just crying out to Jesus, now is the time, let's start the revolution. And when it doesn't happen, it really sets up his betrayal later on. That's when I realized, you know what? I really like this version of Jesus, and I'm going to give him a B rank. Jumping off from that point, I think they set up Judas's betrayal very well in this movie, and you really sympathize with him. This is a guy who just wanted to see his family again and thought that Jesus was the guy who was going to do that for him on earth in this life. And as we've seen in many of these Jesus movies, the people had a very different version of the Messiah that they were expecting, a much more militant Messiah. So Judas in this movie decided to betray Jesus to jumpstart the revolution. That's yet another thing I really liked about this movie. I thought Judas was very well done. But obviously, Jesus is not the main character. Judas is not the main character. Mary Magdalene is the main character. And I've always liked Mary Magdalene and her various portrayals that I've seen throughout many of these Jesus movies. She's a very important person in the Gospels. She is the first person to witness Christ after he has been resurrected. I couldn't tell you what was on Garth Davis, the director of this movie's heart. I am just going to tell you what I experienced, and I am happy for any other opinions in the comments with people that disagreed with me. I see a lot of just political motivations working their way into this movie, and it ended up just making it feel a little bit yucky for me, which is not typically how I want to feel after watching a movie where Jesus gets resurrected. It's supposed to feel hopeful. And for me, the end of this movie felt a little bit spiteful, a little bit resentful, a little bit angry. It didn't feel inspiring. So as mentioned, Mary Magdalene is in an arranged marriage at the beginning of this movie, and she really doesn't want to get married to this guy, and so they think she's kind of weird and that she must have some sort of demon in her. And so they try to drown her to drown out the demon or something. Maybe it's some sort of baptism parallel. They almost end up killing her, and they call on Jesus to exorcise her, and Jesus is like, hey, you don't got any demons in you. You're just perfect the way you are. So she leaves her family and she follows Jesus. And the apostles are often kind of condescending and rude to Mary Magdalene, always dismissing her, even when the movie itself portrays her as, oh, she's always in the right and she always understands Jesus better than any of the other apostles. And then when she's the first one to witness the resurrection of Jesus and she goes to tell the other apostles, Peter is at first very dismissive, but then he ends up saying, you know what? I actually believe you that he's back. But this is where it gets kind of weird. Peter was mad that Jesus went to her, a woman, before he went to Peter. That just felt very cynical to a degree that I felt a little bit uncomfortable with, especially because I love St. Peter so much. And I didn't really appreciate that portrayal of the person. And then when you go to this text at the end of the movie where, oh, she was wrongfully portrayed as a prostitute for years, her reputation was tarnished. It felt like they were trying to work in this, the apostles didn't like Mary because she was a woman. The only reason she was portrayed as a prostitute is because people were trying to tarnish her good name. I've just never seen it that way at all. And I think it's especially annoying in this particular movie when it's almost like they're trying to be like, this is the accurate portrayal of her. This is the true portrayal of Mary Magdalene. Yet they completely skip over her being possessed by 7 demons and Jesus having to exorcise her. They just act like that was something that never happened and it was just made up because she didn't want to get married. I'm not against political commentary or expressing your artistic opinion. I'm not even against this movie. If you want to have a message about why Mary Magdalene's important, that's fine. If you want to have a message about how women had it hard back in the day, that's fine too, because they definitely did. If you have to tear down St. Peter and other apostles to get that message across, if that's like the only way you can think about doing it, and also just fabricating history and acting like this is the true story to do it, it's not really a movie that I'm that interested in watching. But that being said, I get that everyone has a different level of comfortability and everything impacts people differently. So if you liked Mary Magdalene and it really stood out to you and the theme spoke to you, that's great. All power to you. I'm not here to rain on your parade. This is just how I felt watching the movie. So for that reason alone, I'm going to give Mary Magdalene a D rank. But moving on to the big 2025, we have Light of the World. Directed by Tom Bancroft and John J. Schaefer, this movie follows the perspective of John the Apostle as he encounters the Messiah, Jesus Christ, and witnesses his life, death, and resurrection. We finally made it all the way up to 2025. This is the only movie on the list that I couldn't have reviewed in my first video because it wasn't out when I did my first video. So I think it's pretty cool that we got 2 animated Jesus movies in the year 2025. But the question is, which one did I like better? I'll start off with some things that I liked about this movie. First off, the animation style. If you can remember back to when I talked about the Miracle Makers 2D sections, it felt like it was going for more of an ancient style, and Light of the World felt like it was actually channeling that 2D style, but for the entire movie. Very colorful, very poppy, and as someone who likes 2D animation more than 3D animation, I will say that I liked the animation in this movie more than the animation in The King of Kings, even though I think the animation in The King of Kings had a little bit more gravitas to what it was trying to do. Another thing that I liked about this movie is just the fun vibe that it had. It was super colorful, super charming. I could definitely see myself showing this to my future kids one day. It was very digestible, I'll say, with its dialogue and what it's trying to say. And my favorite part of this movie was actually Jesus Christ himself, voiced by Ian Hanlon. A big theme of this movie is that basically everyone was looking for a very militant Messiah, and this is in the time of a very militant Rome, where Rome was oppressing the Jewish people heavily in Jerusalem. And so naturally, the Jewish people are expecting a very militant Messiah. And I like how they set up right from the get-go that this version of Jesus is going to be a little bit different. I also like how chill and personable and compassionate he is in his first encounters with the Apostle John, and honestly with all of his apostles when he first meets them. But as he approaches the crucifixion, you see his demeanor switch to being much more serious, while his apostles are getting more excited because they think the kingdom of heaven is finally at hand. And John is really the only one who notices the demeanor shift in Jesus. And I think it does a really good job illustrating just how novel and unexpected Jesus was at this time, and how he really was just a different type of Messiah, a loving Messiah. And I think he had a really great range between being happy and compassionate to truly sorrowful and exhibiting pain. And for a kids movie, I think they did about as good of a job as they could have showing the gnarliness of the crucifixion and just how devastated everyone was, but also the hopeful optimism when he is finally resurrected. If I had to put some complaints, at times I'd say he bordered on just being too much of a regular guy, too friendly, lacking that divine element that I'm really looking for, which is why I'm going to give him a very respectable B rank. So you might be thinking at this point that Light of the World is going to be a slam dunk. Well, unfortunately, I have some bad news for y'all. It is a kids movie at the end of the day, and I don't know if you can tell by my luscious beard here, but I am not a kid anymore. As I mentioned, the dialogue is very digestible, and by digestible I mean code for it is really, really dumbed down for kids, where it feels like they are trying to explain to you in the most simple and basic way the concepts of the gospel, very similar to the King of Kings. And that's fine, because this is a kids movie. And like I said, I would enjoy watching it with my kids. That is the optimal way to view this movie, I imagine. But unfortunately, I don't have any children of my own right now, and so I wasn't able to experience it that way. The other big problem I have with this movie, and I mean it was a big problem for me, the portrayal of the Apostle John. For whatever reason, they made the creative decision to have him sound prepubescent, very, very young. And I get that the Apostle John is probably the youngest of all of the apostles because he lived the longest, but making him an actual child just felt a little bit too far for me, and also led to him being kind of annoying.
I brought someone who can help. This is Jesus.
I will stand by that I liked him more than the redhead kid, Charles Dickens' son, in the 2025 movie King of Kings, but I still felt like he was in that annoying lane where it was focusing a lot on him, and I didn't find him particularly interesting. As I mentioned, he was kind of annoying, and he is the character with by far the most screen time. So despite liking the animation and the Jesus a lot, and even the themes to an extent, the dumbed down nature for kids and the annoyance of the protagonist, I'm going to have to give Light of the World a C rank. And hey, that's the video. Wait, what? I missed a movie? Oh yeah, I gotta talk about Jesus Christ Superstar. Woo! Going back to 1973, we have Jesus Christ Superstar, which is a film adaptation of the Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice rock opera. Directed by Norman Jewison and shot on location in Israel, the film tells the story of Jesus' final days from the perspective of Judas Iscariot. When I made my ranking review of Jesus Christ Superstar last year, I thought it was a silly, dumb movie that no one really liked. So I just thought it would be funny to turn it into a bit where I just thought it was horrible, because surely everyone thought it was horrible. The comments did not think it was horrible. The comments think it's awesome. A lot of people challenged my media literacy after seeing my review, and so I felt somewhat obligated, if I was going to do a sequel video, to giving Jesus Christ Superstar the proper respect that it deserved, because I didn't know that it was so beloved by many. So for you viewers, I guess, here's my review of Jesus Christ Superstar. This was one of the last movies I decided to rewatch again for this video because I wanted it to be somewhat fresh in my mind by the time I ended up filming. So the question you might have to yourself is, did the rewatch of Jesus Christ Superstar make me like it more? I will say yes, just a little bit. I will say the number one thing that made me like Jesus Christ Superstar, even before I rewatched it, was experiencing the atrocity that was Godspell. That movie was so bad, I was like, man, Jesus Christ Superstar seems like a masterpiece compared to that. Going into some positives that I noticed on the rewatches. Number one, I think the music grew on me just a little bit. 70s rock opera isn't exactly the music of choice that I would have chosen for a Jesus movie, but a lot of it's pretty catchy. I like a lot of the plucky guitar work. I'm not a musician, so I don't know the exact terms, but I actually thought it worked pretty well in retrospect. I like the refrain for the
Jesus Christ Superstar. Do you think you're what they say you are?
that got stuck in my head. The song Mary Magdalene sings is stuck in my head.
Try not to get worried, try not to turn on to problems that upset you.
I like the song with Judas.
I had no thought at all about my own reward. I really didn't come here of my own accord. Just don't say I'm...
That was pretty good. And so, if you're going to have a musical, you should at least think the music is good. And I would say on rewatch, I did find myself jamming out and vibing with the music just a little bit more. Unfortunately for you fans of Jesus Christ Superstar, musicals are really not my genre of choice. I like Sound of Music, and outside of that, I'm very, very picky. I don't really see myself going back to listen to any of the Jesus Christ Superstar music. How is the filmmaking? It's alright. It's good, you know, got that 70s color, but it's not anything super special for me. How was the dancing? I thought it was interesting. I thought some of the outfits were interesting for the time. A little weird. I'll say the best part for me, many of you might have suspected this, is Judas. I feel like this is a reoccurring thing in this video of Judas being kind of cool in some of these movies. Or not cool, but an interesting version per se. Much like Day of Triumph, Jesus Christ Superstar takes the POV of Judas, and from Judas's perspective, he sees Jesus as someone who's starting to inhale the praise a little bit too much and getting distracted from his mission. And that's very prevalent to him when Mary Magdalene, who is a prostitute in this version of the story, is getting all up in Jesus's business, and he's not exactly a fan with that. And honestly, the way it's portrayed in this movie, I can't even really be mad at Judas for thinking Jesus is getting distracted. Heck, I'm watching this movie and I'm thinking Jesus is getting distracted. And the way I feel Judas sees things in this movie is that Jesus is getting out of control. Things are going to get worse with the Romans. Something needs to happen. And that is his chief motivation for turning Jesus in. But he's also someone who's critical of Jesus if he is the Messiah for the time he decided to come to the world. Even one of the songs says, it's like, why didn't you come during a time of mass communications? Which I thought was an interesting line from Judas. So overall, I thought it was a sympathetic, well-acted version of Judas. But we're not ranking Judases in this video. We're ranking Jesus movies and Jesus portrayals. So how did Ted Neely do as Jesus Christ? Okay, I'm kidding. I'm not giving him an E rank, but I don't like the portrayal all that much. He seems very emotionally volatile. He just always seemed to be like crashing out in like every scene. He's crashing out at Judas. He's crashing out at the apostles. He's crashing out at his own followers. And look, Jesus for sure got upset in the Bible lots of times, and at all of those people for what it's worth. Really, I just didn't see Jesus. And no matter how hard you try to tell me Ted Neely's Jesus, I just had a really hard time buying it at the end of the day. I could try to give you as many logical reasons as I can. I think ultimately they'll just fall flat. What I'm going to settle with is that this version of Jesus was just not my vibe, and I'm going to give him a D rank. But getting back to the movie itself, what is the big problem with Jesus Christ Superstar? When I watched it the first time for my first video, I thought it was a little bit irreverent, kind of goofy. I couldn't really take it seriously because of the 70s-esque music, aesthetic, and visuals. So at the end of the day, I still feel like it's a really goofy movie. I just wasn't getting invested into the struggle. I wasn't getting invested into Judas betraying Jesus and their brotherhood being broken like maybe many of you were watching this movie, because I just had a hard time taking the 70s music with a Jesus setting seriously. I could see someone making a really great, well thought out masterpiece argument for me here on why Jesus Christ Superstar is actually just secretly the best. It's just secretly so awesome. And you might be right. So what I will end with here on Jesus Christ Superstar, this is an argument that really can't be defeated on my part. This movie is just not my vibe. It's goofy, it's irreverent, I don't really find it that interesting, even though it's got a good version of Judas. As I've mentioned, plenty of other good versions of Judas in other movies that aren't musicals, that are 70s rock operas. It's just not my vibe, and I didn't enjoy watching it because of that. That's all I can really say. But upon the rewatch, I understand why you guys liked it, and because I'm in a spirit of understanding, going to give Jesus Christ Superstar a D rank. And hey, that's the end of the video. Right now on screen there should be a bunch of different rankings from both this video, last video, comparing the two, different portrayals, etc. If you made it to the end, I just want to say thank you so much for watching and making this video possible in the first place, and even beyond all of the suggestions for movies, the suggestions for churches and denominations, and your thoughts and prayers and encouragement for me on this spiritual journey. I really appreciated all of the input you guys gave me. If you saw my last video, you'd know I became a non-denominational Christian in search of a denomination, and as of the time of this video coming out, I will have been confirmed in the Catholic Church, which is an exciting moment for me and for all the people who encouraged me on this journey, both in my life but also in the comment section of my Jesus video. I just want to say thank you so much, and I'm happy to come home. And I'm really happy that this Easter I was able to revisit this topic of Jesus movies and really start to feel like a connoisseur of Jesus movies. I mean, I feel like I've seen a lot at this point, and you know, there's some good ones, there's some bad ones, but something that I can respect is that it's all for the love of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and that's really what everything is about, especially during this season of Easter. So God bless you all, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you later.